Hello, esteemed panelists or guests, and hello, everybody in attendance, and welcome to this webinar. Wishing you a good day, good evening, or good night, because we have participants from all over the world, and I'm honored and privileged to be the host and moderator for this webinar. I would like to introduce the first speaker, Walter Scott Murch, the artist's son. Walter Scott Murch had the foresight to document on 5x7 transparency the works in his father's 1966 retrospective and had them digitized by his own son, Walter Slater Murch, and thus providing many of the high-resolution images found in the monograph. And I would like also to take the opportunity to welcome George Lucas, Judy Collischan, and Winslow Myers, and hand over to Walter to just continue our wonderful celebration of Walter Tandy Murch, Walter's father's monograph released by Rizzoli.
Thank you, Brane. It's really great that we're all together here celebrating the publishing of this monograph, which has been gestating for 54 years since my father died in 1967. There had been a big retrospective of his paintings organized by Daniel Robbins at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1966, and it traveled all around Canada and the United States in 1967, and it was finally going to land at the Brooklyn Museum in December of 67, when my father had a heart attack and died suddenly giving a speech at the Skowhegan Art School fundraiser. Naturally, a huge trauma for the family and for Skowhegan and for the Brooklyn Museum. So the show became a memorial in a sense, and it was very well received. But thinking about it afterwards, in the weeks afterwards, I thought, I don't think these paintings are going to be together again in the near future, so I better document them. And I found a friend who had a friend and who was an art photographer, and we took 5x7 transparencies, many of which are in the Rizzoli book. I didn't know it at the time, but a student of my dad's, Winslow Myers, visited my mother in 1968, and she and he were putting their heads together to see if a monograph could be published with color illustrations of all of the paintings. Unfortunately, my mother died in December of 1969, and there were many decades after that where the idea of the book was a remote possibility. But Winslow kept the faith, and about 10 years ago approached me with the idea, and I dug out those old transparencies, and one thing led to another. But Winslow was more involved in the early stages of that, so I think I'll let him pick up the story from here.
So thank you, Walter. And it has been a long and winding road to the publication of this book, but I couldn't be happier with about the way it turned out. I was only a graduate student in my mid-20s who had taken a couple of courses with Murch at BU just before he died so suddenly. When I proposed to Catherine Murch, his widow, that Murch deserved just such a book as we are now celebrating, she responded, "We'll have to find just exactly the right people for that." And we finally did. But first, there was some time in the wilderness and a frustrated search for a combination of funds and a publisher. Among others, I solicited the late Larry Fleischman, who was my dealer at Kennedy Galleries in the 1970s. Everybody I talked to knew exactly who Murch was and thought a big monograph was an important idea, but nobody bit. Finally, however, we were graced with the desired alignment of forces in the form of our various authors, along with Deb Thompson, our researcher, book designer David Skulkin, and Andrea Denise and Margaret Chase from Rizzoli. George Lucas did triple duty by providing an insightful foreword, access to his prolific collection of Murch works, and indispensable financial support. Once the stars did align, the process snowballed, and I was delighted to take my place as just another member of a team. This book is going to allow lots of people to experience Murch, both as a great artist, but also as a person, especially thanks to Walter's wonderful reminiscences. There's been an enormous curiosity about this book on the part of art teachers, especially, who often use Murch as an example of quality in poetry to show their students. Back to you, Brane.
Thank you very much. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker. The filmmaker and philanthropist George Lucas has been nominated for 4 Academy Awards. In 1991, he established the George Lucas Education Foundation, which promotes and celebrates innovation in schools. He not only attended film school at the University of Southern California with Murch's son, Walter Scott Murch, but gradually amassed over the years a formidable collection of important Murch paintings and drawings. His support has been indispensable to this project. George, please share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Walter and I met in the dark room of the USC cinema department. And our friendship was born there, and it's been there ever since, getting closer and closer. I moved to San Francisco, and I got Walter to move to San Francisco. We were working on films with Francis Coppola. And so it was a sort of a cauldron of creativity. And he worked on co-wrote my first film, THX, and he did all the sound work, which was very avant-garde at the time. We've always been very close. And when it came up that he was having a hard time with the book, I said, well, I'll help you with the book. I'll help you with the book. And so I helped finance an early version which didn't go anywhere. And then we managed to get a publisher. And I was proud to be involved with it because I love Murch's work. I mean, the father. We're the different generations here. This is the younger generation, and then we have the older generation. But I love Murch, and I was collecting a lot of illustrators because I think illustrators are the unsung heroes of the art world. You know, he did a lot of work for the Scientific American and a lot of other magazine covers and everything, and that's right up my alley. And I love just the emotional content of what is essentially a still life. As time progressed on, and we were working on the book, I began to realize that a lot of the contemporary art is sort of doing what Walter's father did, which is they're doing, still lives of machinery, still lives of scientific things. And there was I still think Walter's father is better at it than the contemporary people, but it was a prophecy of a different kind of art, which before that time was filled with flowers and things like that, objects, dollar bills stuck on walls. But his is really much more emotional than most of the still lives I've seen. I mean, they're emotional in a way of, that's a pretty bouquet of flowers, but this is more, modern in the subject matter, but it's not the kind of art that gets recognized. And I was hoping that the book would help up his image, because I think at some point people are going to realize how great this is. And so, except I have a lot of Murches, but I'm not going to sell them. I have a museum, but unfortunately the museum is about narrative art, and which is usually human beings, a lot of Rockwells and Wyeths and things. But maybe someday I'll just build a separate museum for Murch. That's about all I can say, other than, I could go on forever, but
Thank you very much, George. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy with the museum work and everything, and your creative work is ongoing. I'll take the opportunity to introduce our next presenter speaker. Judy Collischan is the premier scholar of Murch's art, wrote her doctoral thesis on the artist in 1972. This exhaustive work of research includes a catalog, raisonné, and significant supporting information. In addition to teaching at the university level for 13 years, she has presented numerous lectures, served on many juries and panels, and organized over 100 exhibitions, including one devoted to Murch in 1987 at the Whitney Museum of American Art at Philip Morris and at Long Island University. She's the author of Lines of Vision, Drawing by Contemporary Women, Welded Sculpture of the 20th Century, another title, Contemporary Classicism, and Made in the USA, Modern/Contemporary Art in America. At present, Judy is less focused on studying, curating, and writing about art and more preoccupied with making art. The title of her presentation is Walter Tandy Murch, A Style of His Own. In parentheses, historical and contemporaneous influences on Murch and relationships of his work with that of other artists.
I was very interested in George Lucas's words because what I want to do in my presentation follows exactly, in many ways, his thoughts about Murch. And one of the words that stuck out to me was prophecy, because I feel that Walter Murch's work was very individualistic, very unusual for its time. And that particular time was a time of categorization. Walter Tandy Murch didn't fit. But today, there is not so much categorization of artists, which I think is really an unfair kind of practice anyway. And as a result, this is a celebration of Walter Tandy Murch. It's a publication of a beautiful book. And I feel that his time is here. And at least I hope so. And I know we all hope so. Okay, we now have the first slide. So there were many artists that Walter Murch looked at, particularly early on as he was forming his own style. And for a time, he was very interested in old master work. He picked, of course, people who were doing still life, although I'm not sure that term fits Murch, and I'll talk about that. But Chardin, you see here, is one still life that kind of bears comparison to Murch. He liked Chardin's work, and the style of this painting is something like Walter Murch's style that he evolved, in that the objects are set on a shallow shelf in front of a kind of a blank background, undifferentiated background, and very common objects are used by Chardin here. These objects are recognizable for the period in which Chardin lived and worked. Next slide. He was also interested in Vermeer, and I should say with Chardin and Vermeer and Rembrandt, whom Murch also admired, there's the quality of light. Light was very important in Vermeer's time and Rembrandt's time, particularly in the Baroque period. And Vermeer, there's a still life in the foreground, but he introduces a sleeping maid. Not particularly an exciting subject matter, but he was in the Netherlands, and it was a Protestant country at the time, and he was not interested in depicting Christ on the cross or some mythological Venus on the half shell or whatever. He was depicting ordinary life. Murch did that too. And in this case, of course, the space is deeper. There are planes of space that go back, not one point perspective, but planes that reach back into space. And I would also, and of course, Murch was not interested in that definition of space, but he was interested in the rug on the table. And he did employ a similar kind of rug in a few of his paintings. Next slide, please. So now we come to Murch, and this is the clock of 1950. Yes, a clock is a common object. However, he took the front of the clock off. He wanted to look at the interiors of objects. That's different, isn't it? That's very different. And I feel that that's sort of a metaphor for what he was trying to do in his work as an artist. He was trying to go inside himself to express some sort of an essence of creativity that he felt flowed through him. And so he constantly chooses objects and then takes the front or the case or whatever off, and you're faced with maybe something that you wouldn't recognize as a clock. I wouldn't. And he juxtaposes it. He puts it right in the front and right in the center, and he perches it on two what appear to be blocks. And there's the shallow space, like in Chardin, and there is a shallow shelf, like in Chardin. And the background is relatively undifferentiated. But he has some sort of, fruit or vegetable or some sort of object on the left, and some little pieces of things, and a rock on the top. So there is different kinds of objects, not objects that we would normally see at the time this was painted in 1950, I think. But the idea of the clock as an object to paint is an ordinary object. He just did it in a much different way than anyone else. Next slide, please. And this is a work by Pierre Roy, Daylight Savings Time, controversial subject, of 1925. Murch was a great fan of Roy, and Roy's work, although he was French, his work was being shown by Julian Levy in New York, and Murch saw it there. And now we get a surrealist influence on Murch's work, which is very strong. The idea of chance, the idea of juxtaposition of different kinds of forms, different kinds of objects, a sort of a dreamlike quality. And Pierre Roy, you can see here, is associating very kind of disparate objects. A watch, but the watch has the front on, unlike Murch. And this funny thing in the foreground on the right that is just set there, kind of perched there. It could roll off, it could roll back. That sort of perching is also something that Murch does, and we'll see some examples of that. Next slide, please. He was friendly with other artists. He was very friendly with Joseph Cornell. And this is a box by Joseph Cornell, Habitat for a Shooting Gallery of 1943, about the time that they were very friendly and knew one another. Interesting here is the rock that these birds seem to be perched on. It's a shallow space like that Murch decided to employ. And there's a disparate association of objects, birds and rocks and I don't know what, money, different kinds of things. So that sort of juxtaposition is definitely a surrealist quality. Plus, Joseph Cornell is known for his boxes, for putting these disparate things in a box on a stage, like a theater, like a presentation. And I suggest to you that this is a kind of feeling that was picked up by Murch in his work. Next slide, please. Metronome, one of my early favorites. I should say that when I started the dissertation, this was a long time ago, in the late 60s, shortly after Walter Tandy Murch died, and I've always been sorry that I never got to meet him. But I saw his little catalog from the Brooklyn Museum in the University of Iowa Library, and I was kind of blown away because I had never seen anything like this before, never. And you know, these little machines and the objects and the metronome is levitating. It's rising up like a rocket or something off of this shallow shelf again. Now, Murch, I think, painted out, decided that it looked good that way, but it also adds a sense of mystery, a sense of precariousness, a sense of a moment before something is going to happen, that that's going to shoot off into space or something. And so, and also, it kind of questions the physicality of the object, because the physicality of the objects in Murch's work is constantly broken down as he develops his style. There was music in the family, and I've always thought that that interest in sound went right straight through to Walter Scott. Next slide, please. He also knew Arshil Gorky. Now, wow, isn't that different? How can that possibly be part of Walter Murch's work? Gorky was Murch's teacher early on, and they had a very strong friendship. They went to Museum of Modern Art to see an exhibition by Cezanne, who was also important to Walter Murch. But I think what Murch got from Gorky in conversations about art, which they surely must have had, is Gorky's interest in chance effects, in dripping, in the accidental things that happen when you create art, and to make use of those as a kind of starting point, actually, for his work. Next slide, please. Jackson Pollock. Interestingly enough, you may think that this is really a far-fetched comparison to Walter Murch, but Betty Parsons showed them both at her gallery. And Pollock here there's a quality to Pollock's work here that I think is relative to Walter Murch, and that is that the flatness of the picture plane is emphasized. It's not just acknowledged, it's emphasized. The edges flatten that picture plane. They emphasize the flatness of the picture plane. This is Clement Greenberg's heyday, when flatness was all, that a painting was, after all, a flat surface and some marks on top of that flat surface. But some of the things that are prevalent in Pollock also occur in Walter Murch, and I'm going to try to point them out. Next slide. Extension. This is a sewing machine. It looks much like an old portable sewing machine that I still have, except mine has a case on it. Mine has a cover. Murch, again, takes that off. He's interested in the inside, in the interior, as he was interested in what was inside himself that he could make into art. That's how actually Betty Parsons described it, that he was wanted to actually go inside himself to bring it out into art. So here, the reason that I brought this is because I see that same extension of the subject matter here outside of the picture plane. And I'm relating that to Pollock. And I'm relating it for the same reason, that it flattens space. That edge at the side, that's a line. An edge is a line. That line lies on a surface. And although it certainly isn't entirely flat, this painting, it does have that kind of extension and that sort of emphasis upon the surface. Next slide, please. Gray Millen, toward the end of his career, his interest in drawing is a little bit curious, because when he paints, he doesn't necessarily draw on the canvas. When he did commercial work, he did many studies in different media and so forth. And then apparently one was chosen and reworked. But later in his life, he began to draw more. And now I think, and this is a later work, it's in the 60s, sometime 1965, so it's very late. Now you can see even more relationship to Pollock, can you not? You know, you see all these smudges and fingerprints, maybe, whatever he did to this particular piece of paper before he began to put the image of a melon on it. Walter Scott talks in this essay about walking over paper in their home. He put paper in the bathtub. He put it on the floor. He wanted something to start, and then that he could pick up on and make something out of. He had, many artists, and I have had this experience too, when you're looking at a blank canvas or a blank piece of paper or a blank anything. I don't know what the term would be in film, but it's hard to start. It's kind of overwhelming. And he had a way of trying to start something accidental before he developed the image. Interesting to me in this Gray Millen piece is not only the all over surface quality that you have, but the shadow not just of the melon and the strong light that comes down from the left, but the geometric shadow underneath it. I think it's a nice juxtaposition of organic and then a geometric plane that comes off into space. And now that shallow space, you can't really tell where it is, where it ends, where it goes in the background. So there's greater flatness. Next slide, please. Jasper Johns, there's been a lot of, well, not a lot, but comparisons of Murch to Jasper Johns because they did some similar subject matter, namely a light bulb. And who went first, I don't know. I wrote to Jasper Johns in the course of doing my dissertation, and he acknowledged that he had seen Walter Murch's work, but didn't think there was any influence. And I think it's probably true. I take him for his word on that. But Jasper Johns' subject matter outside of a light bulb and a flashlight, and the subject matter that he's most famous for are flags and targets, flat things. Now, a flag is not necessarily flat except when it's laying down or it's folded or it's not in use. His flag is not unfurled, beautifully flying in the wind. It's perfectly flat. So his subject matter, different from Murch's, has a more of a political context, I think, the American flag. And this particular piece in 1954 is the perfect opportunity to just push this flag as far as Jasper Johns could, because it was a period when America was enjoying economic superiority. It had become a world power after World War II, and so made in America, this flag sort of says. The surface is an interesting one because he used encaustic wax and he put bits of newspaper in there. So you have a kind of all over kind of surface. If you could think back to the Pollock that I showed you, the Pollock was flat. This one has a little bit of depth. It's almost like a relief sculpture, except because of all the bars and rectangles and so forth, it's very flat. Honestly, I think the surfaces of Walter Murch's paintings are much more interesting because they're much more varied. This surface is an all-over surface. It's the same across the whole and across the entire painting. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to sort of compare that with the two doors that I think you're going to see more of in the context of this webinar. Because like the flag, these two doors come very close to the surface. You could say that just Jasper Johns' flag was on the surface in a way, although the surface was a little bit three-dimensional, a little bit relief-like. And this surface is not as flat. However, if you look around the two doors, you see all these painterly kind of marks that move around on the surface. And over on the right, the background and the door almost merges. There's just a slight line there. So again, there's a kind of flatness to it all. The flag that Jasper Johns showed was a new flag. It wasn't wrinkled, it wasn't soiled. And these doors are old, I think. They look rusty. They look maybe like they've seen better days than when they found their way into Murch's work. And he's propped them up. You can see little bricks or something underneath the doors, and they're standing there almost like sentinels. But there is a very distinctive recognition of the picture plane. Murch was wrestling with the notion of how to integrate painting an object with painting a painting. And I think the conclusion he came to was the painting itself as an object. There's an object there, but the painting itself is an object. Next slide, please. Morandi. I kind of added this at the last minute because I saw that Zwirner Gallery, one of the big mega galleries in New York that are so popular now, is having yet another show of Morandi. Morandi has been recognized for his still life paintings, which are very different than Walter Murch. There's not a sense of interior here, and the objects are very physical. They have a weightiness to them that Murch denies in his painting. But can we have the next slide? What I am hoping for, and again, I'll go back to George Lucas's word prophecy, is that Morandi's reputation is undergoing a resurgence, thanks to Zwirner Gallery, I suppose. But I'm hoping with this book, and maybe with this webinar, that Murch's reputation will also undergo a resurgence. And I think it can, because his style was his own. It's different than anybody else's. You cannot categorize it. And in today's art, we don't have those categories anymore. You know, I mean, the last one, which was, I think, very unsuccessful, was postmodern. What the hell is that? You know, I mean, no one knows. But at any rate, I'm going to show you lastly the two works that I like a lot. The cooked eel, which is kind of big for Murch. It's almost 40 inches long. But it floats. The fish is floating. Maybe it's underwater. I don't know, but it's floating on the picture plane. It has very little weight, very little substance. Instead, it meshes with the rest of the painting, which is also on the surface. And I point out again, it extends beyond the picture plane, which helps promote the notion of flatness. One last slide. Another favorite of mine among his drawings is wig forms. Walter Murch did not paint many figurative pieces or draw many figurative pieces. And when he did, they were dolls or forms or artificial in some way. And I think this was because how was he going to get a model into his home studio at night, which was the only time he had to work? You know, he was a very busy person. He was a husband, he was a father, he was doing commercial work, he was doing teaching, sometimes in two different places. And then trying to do his own work late at night, which maybe in fact contributes to the light that you see so much in Walter Murch's work. So the figurative work that he does is like forms, artificial forms, which for, you know, would maybe a wig or a hat or something you'd see in a store window. Interesting is the way he posed them. Again, you can hardly tell this is a shelf. Hardly tell that there's a shelf there. The space is so flat. The one form at the left comes out a bit, but it's cut off by the edge, which again flattens it. And the form in the middle, I think, is a profile. It's a little bit hard to tell, and I think that's intentional. And then the one on the right is a back view. And so he has these different kind of positions of the forms, but basically, if you look at the way the forms are rendered and the way that the rest of the page is rendered, you can see the smudges, the marks, the overall surface that was important to Murch. So I titled this A Style of Its Own because I feel that that's his strong point, and that if his reputation is to increase now with the publication of the book, I think that is his strong point. That is his strength. His work is not like anyone else's. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, very much. And at this point, I would like to ask all of the participants in the webinar to feel free to ask questions via simple Zoom made Q&A tool that is available to everybody who is attending, and we'll make every attempt at the end of the presentation to have those questions answered. I'll just revisit our first speaker with the introduction of who Winslow is. Winslow Myers is someone who studied art under Walter Tandy Murch at Boston University and later chaired the visual arts program at the Bancroft School in Worcester, Massachusetts, a position he held for full 30 years. He is the author of Living Beyond the War, A Citizen's Guide, has published more than 150 peace-oriented opinion editorials in print and online, and serves on the advisory board of the War Prevention Initiative. His website where his artwork can be seen is www.winslowmyers.com. And I'll just ask Winslow to be kind enough, and I'll prepare his for images and slides, and just take over, Winslow, please.
Thanks, Brane. I love everything that Judy said, and just remember that Murch, there's some question about whether Murch and Johns ever met, but Murch did say, Jasper Johns helps me, and maybe I can help him. And there was a nice kind of sweet collegiality in that, where Murch was humble and ready to get help from wherever he could. Maybe put up a Broken Rock, Brane. So this is a painting from 1964. It measures about 46 by 36. That, along with two doors, effectively represents the triumphant quality of the work Murch did in the last 3 or 4 years of his life, where he really fulfilled his own premises and explorations on a whole different level. Anyone new to Murch needs to know a couple of basic facts. Judy mentioned he painted at night. He said once, when the competition was asleep, he used an ordinary spotlight with a bulb to illuminate his objects and his easel. And as Scott Murch may mention, he had only one working eye, which just is incredible to think about. Labels are inadequate, but I like to call this still life as mindscape. And here's a place where it relates to Gorky, where you feel like you're in Gorky's mind somehow. And Murch said, with this kind of painting, you're looking directly into the mind of the artist, because, as Judy pointed out, the painting overall is the real subject and not the object within. I think one of the overall arcs of Murch's work that's very interesting is that he kind of starts out with nostalgic objects like that old sewing machine or a phonograph. And as Judy said, he takes things apart, which gets kind of into the interior. But then in the last few years of his work, it's almost like he gets beyond all that into something completely new. Here's the rug that clearly comes from Vermeer. But this painting, even though it's hard to see in reproduction, actually uses thrown paint. So it's both tightly and loosely painted at the same time, because he's very precise about getting a sense of light and air. And it suffuses the whole work and kind of glows out from within. Not to be pretentious, but it really helped me to understand Murch when I read that the Buddha used the Pali word pativeda, penetration, meaning to see things in their true nature without name and label. The Buddha said that this penetration is possible only when the mind is free of all impurities and is fully developed through meditation. I feel like Murch's work, his working is a meditate. He's meditating as he's working. And of course, he had this uncanny ability to break the habitual way that we look at things. But it took him a lifetime of hard work in a single direction for a painting like this to emerge. One of our dead ends earlier in getting the book together was that we hired an art historian from a prestigious university to write a foreword. And this gentleman tried to tie Murch back to Harnett and Pito, 19th century Trondoy realists. Well, we just groaned and had to reject the guy's piece, because Murch actually said many times that the whole fool the eye thing was not what he was after. So I can understand why our academic friend went backwards into the previous century. He may not have been exposed to the way that Murch interacted with and constantly learned from his action painter colleagues at the Betty Parsons Gallery. And that steady growth allowed Murch to come up with a kind of art that I would say attempts to get outside of time altogether. There's a beautiful little note that Judy found in his studio after he died, and it goes like this. This is Murch talking. For me, there seems to be no end of wonderful work. There is a release in my mind which makes it clear how I can paint with complete release without any reservations, as if you knew how life could be 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 years from now. One may as well paint as you really would like. So this is the important thing. Some of the work hints at this quality, so there is really no limit to what you can do. Miracle, end quote. I think that's such a wonderful affirmation of how he really reached his fulfillment. It's also interesting to me that someone once asked the action painter Franz Klein what painter would be most likely to be remembered in the distant future. And Klein said Walter Murch, which is kind of an unusual choice for an action painter. I also want to mention Camus, because Camus was one of Murch's intellectual touchstones, so much so that in one of his statements he said, "I will accept and reject, be logical and illogical. To create, I will recreate," end quote. He said it came from Camus, and I was curious about where, and I kind of rooted around and found a speech that Camus had given called Create Dangerously, that he gave a couple of days after he won the Nobel Prize in 1957. Art is neither complete rejection nor complete acceptance of what is. It is simultaneously rejection and acceptance, and this is why it must be a perpetually renewed wrenching apart. The artist constantly lives in such a state of ambiguity, it capable of negating the real and yet eternally bound to question it in its eternally unfinished aspects. In order to paint a still life, there must be confrontation and a mutual adjustment between a painter and an apple. I think that's a wonderful insight into Murch's work, even though Camus didn't know Murch. Could we go to the mural painting? One of the things I quickly wanted to mention was that there's a whole aspect of Murch's work that didn't get into our book because hardly any of it is left. This is an example that Judy found, a reproduction of a mural that Murch, here he was making his living, and he did this for a restaurant in 1951. It happens that even though a lot of other artists were encouraged to work bigger by the mural work that they did for the WPA projects, like Philip Guston, and influenced ultimately, I think, by the Mexican muralists like Rivera, who were in New York at that time, Murch didn't become an American citizen until 1948. So he couldn't participate in the WPA mural projects. Nonetheless, he did do murals for a living. And it just makes me think about his work ethic. I mean, here he is doing something like this all day, going home and painting his own work at night. I don't know when he slept. There's a wonderful story in Daniel Robbins' essay for the 1966 Murch retrospective. Murch had been hired by Vincent Astor and Serge Obolensky in the late 1930s to execute wall murals in the Russian room of the St. Regis Hotel. As Robbins tells it, Murch conceived a running pattern of dark blue and bursts of white and gold, built in the form of horses, sleighs, soldiers in uniform, Russian fur hats, cockades, fashionable ladies. He worked for over 2 months, painting in oil on immense, loose pieces of canvas, and was hardly finished when the Russians marched into Finland. Consequently, Murch had to change the Russian room into the Hawaiian room, an equally vast and expendable vision of Diamond Head, palm trees, water, and surfboarders. It's bizarre to think of the reclusive, introspective Murch as a kind of nightclub Michelangelo. But this too, even if the direct evidence is hardly available, remains a significant part of the story because it demonstrates that his decision to paint on a small scale in his private work was a deliberate choice and not a limitation of temperament or skill. I think in a few of these paintings, especially in this one, there's a sense of scale which is almost mural-like, because one of the things Murch did was to do his commercial work as conscientiously as possible and then somehow have it feed into his private work. And I think this happens here. Okay, Back to you, Brane.
Thank you very much, Winslow. And at this point, I would just like to turn over to Walter, who won an Oscar for his sound design on Francis Coppola's epic 1979 film about the Vietnam War, Apocalypse Now, and 2 Academy Awards for his picture editing and sound design of The English Patient. More recently, Walter has co-written and edited 2 documentaries, the latest being Coup 53, about the 1953 MI6 CIA coup d'etat against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran.
Well, thank you, Brane. I'd like to do something a little different than the other 2 speakers, Winslow and Judy, and take you into the studio with Walter Tandy Murch. This was easy for us as a family because he painted in the dining room, or what used to be the dining room of the apartment that we had on Riverside Drive. And he sealed it off hermetically. He closed the sliding doors, and of course we could go in, but it was an inner sanctum of sorts. So this first picture is him in 1965 painting the 2 Doors, which is a magnificent painting, as you've seen. He painted sitting down. Unlike me, I'm a film editor who edits standing up. Most editors sit down, most painters stand up, but he had a bad back. So he had a rocking chair, and he would rock back to look at the whole painting, and then he would rock forward to do fine work on it. This painting that I don't think we've seen it during this program, but it's featured in the monograph quite prominently, SSBCO, a painting of three bricks with that manufacturer's stamp on it. I was working at Lucasfilm about 15 years ago, walking to work in the editing building, and I just happened to look down at the brick pathway leading to the building. And suddenly my eyes zoomed in on the fact that one of those bricks had the letters SSBCO on it. And this began a long search of how did that brick get there? Is George such a fan of Walter Tandy Murch that he had it made or discovered it somehow? The story is apparently that this brick, which was manufactured in the Hudson Valley sometime in between the late 1800s and the middle of the 20th century, was used in a building, probably, and then the building came down and those bricks were shipped to Sacramento, where they were used to pave a street with. And then Sacramento decided to lift those bricks and pave it with asphalt. And the contractors who were building Lucasfilm at the time got wind of this huge trove of bricks. And so they ordered those bricks to be sent to Marin County. And lo and behold, that SSBCO traveled from the Hudson Valley to here in Nicasio, California, where my eye suddenly spotted it in 2005 when I was editing the film Jarhead. From bricks to bread. This is bread which is in storage a few feet from where I'm talking to you. It's a petrified piece of bread. It's a bread that has turned into a brick. There was a family lore, that anything that went into Dad's studio was preserved, like King Tut's tomb or something. Balloons that went in there did not deflate. Anything organic did not rot. And here is a prime example of this loaf of bread, which is like a piece of tufa, a volcanic piece of bread that has a nice hard knock to it. And he transformed it into the painting, The Loaf of Bread, in 1965. There you see it. And my sister, Louise, went into the studio in the summer of 1967 and took a bunch of photographs. And here the bread is on the ceiling shelf of what used to be the dining room of this apartment. That this is his studio. And it was collected along with a number of his other props. And we have a number of them here in Bolinas, California. Over on the left is the lamps that he used to illuminate his little theaters, and they were just as simple photo floods as can be. There was nothing fancy at all. The window blinds of the studio were drawn. It was a very dark place, even when the sun was blazing outside. I don't know how he did it actually in the summer, because there was no air conditioning back then. We never had an air conditioner. So he was in this little hothouse. Anyway, the source of light for his paintings were these simple photo floods that you see on the upper corner of the shelf there. And here he is in the studio. It was a mess, not to the artist involved, but to anyone coming in and seeing it for the first time. You think, how does he ever find anything? And he resisted ever cleaning it up. It was his mess, and he liked it that way. I think that's probably also the reason that he didn't invite other artists to come in and hang out with him. He didn't want them to see what his situation looked like. Here he is with his brogues standing on car lock to give it a little extra something. He would, before he finished it, he would just do things to them. And this was also another very common seasonal occurrence in the Murch household, is that the long hallway of the apartment would be strewn with canvases and pieces of paper for probably 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month. And he encouraged everyone to step on them, to spill things on them. We had 2 cats who cooperated with this. My sister had a tricycle at one point. He would even put them out on the balcony of the apartment to get the ministrations of the pigeons to help out. And then when he decided that they were ripe, he would bring them in and brush them off and examine them for the best kind of the damage that had been done to them. He called these the hooks on which the painting would hang. He was kind of afraid that if he left the canvas completely bare, that he would come in one evening and discover that the paint had slid off the canvas. Here is a shelf. This is another photograph that Louise took during that summer. You can see Vermeer there, I think. And, some of the books, just a bunch of stuff always circulating through the studio. And wallpaper. This is the original wallpaper of that dining room. I don't know how old it was. It could have been there when the building was built in 1905. But he loved wallpaper, and he and I would go on expeditions in New Hampshire and Maine during summer breaks, and we would go break into houses that were abandoned. He said, "It's okay." I was, 8 or 10 years old, and we'd go upstairs. It was kind of dangerous, and he would scrape off big chunks of old wallpaper, evaluating them with a connoisseur's eye. This is a really good one, but what he was looking at was the flip side of the wallpaper. Not the image, but the other side, where there were little pieces of glue and dead flies and spider webs and holes and other things. These gave him that wonderful sense of something pre-damaged to paint on. It's another example of this idea of the hooks. Here's melon, which is on painting on a piece of wallpaper. Those stains are, I guess, the artifacts of the glue that held the wallpaper firmly in place. Here's a piece of wallpaper itself. This is what we would have seen in the abandoned building. But then if you flip it over, it was, or is, a portrait of my mother, Catherine, that he did in 1946 when I was 3 years old. So he was already engaged in this process from quite early on. This whole idea of damage is fascinating, but it's particularly fascinating for him because he was lightly damaged himself. That when he was born, by the age of 2, he'd begun to exhibit the fact that he preferred his left hand. And in Edwardian Canada at this time, this was not permitted, that everyone should be right-handed. So his parents, his lovely parents, and I never met my grandfather, but my grandmother lived to be 101. They decided to do what everyone did back then, which was to tie the left hand behind his back and force him to use his right hand. Here's a little sketch that he did of himself, a self-sketch in 1932. And here's his left arm. You can see that it's a kind of deformed, almost a thalidomide arm, expressing the fact that his left hand was not the one that he used to paint with. On the other hand, when he would go out and chop wood in New Hampshire, or when he would throw a football or anything involving big muscles, large movements, he would use his left hand. So it certainly wasn't paralyzed. It was just not the hand that he used to do his painting, and when he had to write something, he would use his right hand. Fine motor movements were right hand, big motor movements were left hand. And the other accident that happened to him around age 12 is that he lost the sight in his right eye in a football accident. He went out to catch a pass and he fumbled it, and the point of the football hit his right eye and damaged it. It looked like an ordinary eye, but he couldn't see any detail through it. He could see light. He said it was like looking through a thick sheet of white plastic. So here's a self-portrait in 1940 that he did. His right eye is blinded by this piece of fabric. But what I just noticed recently is that he shaded the fabric such that the right eye seems to make an appearance. It's very subtle. I had never noticed this until just a few weeks ago. And if you bring out the contrast, you can see that there's an eyebrow and an eye kind of lurking there in the shadow areas of the fabric. It's kind of a Shroud of Turin moment here. So a fascinating late discovery. The next year, 1941, he did a self-portrait which he never finished. I don't know whether he ever would have finished it, but the right eye, again, is just roughly sketched out in red. There is no eyeball. And I remember him saying that he didn't like to paint eyeballs because he worked late at night and it gave him a spooky feeling to have the painting that he was working on staring back at him. He said, "Still life doesn't stare back." But he, obviously here he did portraits, but he would tend to paint them with eyes downcast so that he didn't have to paint the eyeball. Here's Joseph Cornell, another 1941 picture. So he doesn't have to confront the eyeball. And a picture of my mother done 5 years earlier, also eyes downcast. And his friend in 1929, when he was 22 years old, William Macmillan, in this case, he didn't even put paint in the area where the eye was. So that's just bare canvas. The eyeballs, or where the eyes are, is just bare canvas. So he clearly had a thing about eyes, probably because he only had one. And if he lost that eye, his career as an artist would be over. So it was a sensitive subject with him. Here are my parents in 1964, so they were 57 years old at the time. And here you can see his right eye. It looks perfectly normal. It's just that he couldn't see anything through it. This was a happy period of their life. The struggles of the 1930s and 1940s, and now the 1960s, his paintings were selling. He decided not to take any more commercial work starting around this time and just dedicate himself to gallery work. And the work itself started to really transform around this time. I may have some things to say later about this during the question period. But I'd like to close this section with just a little tiny, I don't know, it's a little movie, I guess, of a poem or an extract from a book by Vladimir Nabokov, rendered here in a poetic form that he liked very much, about these abandoned objects. And I just, many of the discussions here have been about the painting as an object and the canvas as a two-dimensional surface. And in general, his paintings had a very narrow depth of field, particularly the later paintings like the bowler hat, which just hangs on the paint, so to speak. And there were many paintings like that in the last 4 or 5 years of his life. But nonetheless, he did paint objects. He never, as abstract as the backgrounds are, there was always a very identifiable, well-rendered object where he respects the geometry of the object and the associations with the object. Although he did say, the object is just the pretext to do the painting, but I don't know, I think there's more to it than that, because he definitely gravitated towards certain kinds of objects. Early on, they were mechanical, and later on they became more organic, rocks, pieces of masonry and other things. But up until the early 60s, the object itself had an importance to it. And this section of Nabokov gets at something like that. The transformation, this kind of alchemical transformation of the object into something eternal, I think that definitely was right up his alley. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching and looking and listening. And there are some questions that have come up, and we'll do our best to answer these questions.
Thank you, Walter. And also thanks to Winslow and Judy for their presentations. George Lucas sends his regards. He had to leave for a business meeting, but looks forward to watching the webinar when it's posted on social media. Now for questions from the audience. We have a selection here. The first one is, who chose the painting for the cover of the book? And why was this picture of the bowler hat selected?
I wanted to give credit to David Skulkin, the designer of the book. I think he probably had some input into that decision. The hat is actually Murch's last painting, and it's a beauty. It's very powerful. I think probably Rizzoli and David felt that it would just work perfectly, and I think it does.
Did any of you see a relationship of Murch's work to Edwin Dickerson's?
Yeah, I kind of ambiguity of the image and the painting of the air certainly links the two. I can't remember from my research whether or not Dickinson, whether Murch was aligned with him or liked his work or not. I can't remember if he said anything, but I think there is a kind of relationship between the two. I think Murch's choice of subject matter was quite different, and I think his surface interest was quite different. But the painting of the air is in both, I feel.
One of the questions is, can someone talk about the color or lack of color in the paintings?
There are 3 color zones in my father's work. His gallery work, the paintings that appeared at Betty Parsons' gallery, have warm, earthy tones, reds and browns and blacks. His commercial work is much cooler. I think he did this to separate out in his mind, I'm working on a commission now, this is not for the gallery. So there's lots of turquoise in the backgrounds and in the objects themselves. And then there are the drawings or the drawing paintings, which have almost no color. This is where he said he was painting with a pencil, with a charcoal pencil. And occasionally some very light toned colors will emerge, but basically these are almost monochrome. And I think this helped him separate out the kind of work that he was doing. Is it a drawing? Is it a painting? Or is it a commissioned work?
In the Nabokov film, there is the word duality. Why is it there, and what did it mean to Walter Tandy Murch?
I think duality can mean a lot of things, like light and dark, night and day, good and evil. They're all woven into our lives. But in terms of making art, I think he had it on his easel because it meant for him the tension between random marks and scuffs and drips with which he began the canvas and the deliberate effort to pull out of those unself-conscious beginnings a precise description of his chosen objects surrounded by air.
What you saw in the film was my father's easel board, a big solid plank of wood to which he would attach his canvases or his papers or his wallpaper, whatever it was that he was going to be painting on. And at some point, and I don't know when, he painted the word duality on the top of it to remind himself of this duality that Winslow was just talking about. And I absolutely agree that the duality was this tension between the painting that was a representation of something external in the world, an object, series of objects, but that it was also an object in itself, a canvas or a piece of paper that was scuffed up to begin with. And then during the painting, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years of his life, he would abuse it. Sometimes he actually put his cigarettes out in the surface of the painting. And then, as you saw, he would step on the painting sometime to give it some kind of this objectness. You're not overly aware of this when you look at the paintings, but it was definitely something that he had in mind when he was making the painting.
What is everyone's favorite WTM piece, Walter Tandy Murch piece? So, Judy, what's your favorite piece if you were to
Well,
pick one?
I sort of showed them at the end of my presentation. I love that Cook deal, but I also love the wig forms. And I think the Cook deal, because it is so idiosyncratic, it is so unusual. And the fact that it just floats across the space. And the wig forms, because there is such a sense of mystery about them. And again, it's a very unusual subject matter. And in both of them, there's such a sense of surface, and in the drawing as well as the painting, such a sense of the surface and the artist's hand and all the accidents that he accepted into the piece.
So I think my favorite piece is Air Filter, which is Murch's largest painting. He did this piece when he was at Skowhegan up in Maine in the summer. And two of my fellow graduate students went up to see him and knocked on the door of his studio. And he came to the door in what seemed to be kind of a stupor. And my two graduate friends realized that he had just been so far into doing this work that he took a minute to recover his usual Canadian politeness. And then they all walked over and he knocked on the door of where he was staying. And Catherine Murch said from inside, "What's the matter, Walter? Couldn't you take it?" It's an amazing painting because the students saw that beautiful piece of drapery was an old T-shirt just hung on the edge of a mantelpiece that had been transformed into something really remarkable in its form.
I'm going to pick two paintings, The Eggs and Objects that he did in 1960, and Two Doors, which he painted 5 years later in 1965. Eggs and Objects is a classic early period Murch, even though it was kind of late in his development. But there is the shelf and the four slightly ambiguous objects. Why these objects? A glass full of eggs, a red can, a piano key, and a bottle of turpentine. I don't know whether that's what it is. The background is very neutral, and for personal reasons, I like it because that glass is something that we used as a family every day at the dinner table. So my personal feelings about it are very strong, but I think even if you didn't have those personal feelings, you get a sense of a kind of domesticity about it, even though the objects themselves are such a strange collection. Two Doors, however, is well into his late period. The background seems to overwhelm the doors themselves. Where is the border between the background and the object that he is painting? And the doors themselves have a slightly ominous feeling to it. It turns out that this painting was selected as the cover image for the Journal of American Medicine in 1998 by Therese Southgate, who was a doctor but who had a strong interest in art and was responsible for many of the artistic images that were folded into the magazine during those years. She also wrote an essay that went along with the painting, and it's a lovely pencil sketch, in a sense, of Murch as an artist. They perceptively described him. They say, thoroughly modernist, yet with voices from the past, thoroughly realist, yet with echoes of the abstract. And he was an ordinary oil-on-canvas painter, but one with an extraordinary repertoire of forms. Severely geometric, almost aggressively architectural. His forms lift, soften, and then dissolve in space like ghostly castles. Color is not so much applied to the canvas as oozing from it. This definitely applies to Two Doors, not so much to Eggs and Objects. So you can see the big transition that happened to him in this 5-year period from 1960 to 1965. Therese Southgate concludes her essay by saying, like its title, the painting is ambiguous. There's something ominous about it, a hint even that something sinister lurks there. A story is locked behind those doors. It could be the image of the millennium. And I can't think of any better way to conclude the answer to that question.
We have come to an end, and I would like to thank all participants who came to join with us this celebration, and especially thanks to our esteemed panelists and our guests of honor, I would say, George Lucas, Walter Murch, Judy Collischan, and Winslow Myers. And I wish you all a happy evening or rest of the day or late morning or early morning, wherever you might be in this whole wide world where we come together like tonight and we celebrate arts, and we can't wait to have another opportunity to do it with you again. And best of luck with everything you do in your life. Thank you.